But I'm happy to start us off here. My name's Dr. Andrew Terrell. You can call me Dr. Terrell, Professor Terrell. Since this is sort of your first taste at USD, I will just put out there, most professors prefer to be called either professor or doctor in their last name. I say this because we still have some students. So surprisingly, I every once in a while get an email from a student calling me Andy that I've never met before or something like that. It's not that I wouldn't love to be on a first name basis, but there's sort of just a norm in college and especially at USD to use the term doctor or professor. It wouldn't upset me, but it might upset another professor. So it's a good rule of thumb to just start there. But I'm glad to meet you all. I've been at USD now, I can't believe this, 10 years. I still feel like it's new because I don't know. I guess maybe we all have that sense of imposter syndrome. I still feel like a young professor, but I guess at this point that my beard doesn't lie and I'm turning into an old professor or at least a middle-aged professor. I don't know what age that happens, but I've been there 10 years. And we've been running this. Dr. Smith, how long is this our third year, fourth
It's
year?
the
I'm like
year, yeah.
fourth year. And we've been doing this, and basically this was born in the pandemic. But it was such a good thing that we did during the pandemic to bring students who are ready to start at USD together and give them a little taste of what classes are like, what it's like to interact with professors. It's going to be very different because we're here in Zoom and I I think it's easy to see once you get on campus. It's so much better in person. It's such a nice environment to be in the classroom, but we want to give you a sense of what it's like. So you don't arrive at campus thinking, oh, I've never been in a college class. What's this going to look like? So you'll get a sense of what good analysis looks like. You're going to get a lot of different examples from different fields of study of how professors do their own research and how they'll expect you to think about things and then how to bring those together. So a big part of this is thinking about integration and how to bring different fields of study together. You might get a sense of your interests and what you'd like to possibly study, but that takes some time with that. Don't the point here isn't for you to pick a major. I know some of you come in, really ready to jump into a major. That's great, that's fine, but try to keep an open mind as you complete your core courses. There are lots of interesting things out there, and the number of folks who come to me as an advisor because I also teach in the LLC program. I have a lot of first year students, and some of them are so adamant, and then maybe by second or sometimes even junior year, we'll have a very challenging conversation where they're like, I don't think this was the right major for me. But by that point, it can be very difficult to change. So don't commit to something and start taking a bunch of classes in one area and kind of put yourself down a road that you may not want to be on. Try to keep it open. And that's why the core is there, both to make sure you get a liberal arts education, but also to give you a chance to like sample a lot of different fields of study. And this is your first taste of that. You're going to get a smorgasbord of various fields of study here. We all come from very different backgrounds, and one of the great things is to see the experiences of professor. I was a lawyer for a number of years. I am the pre-law and pre-policy advisor at USD for all students. And then I worked in policy for a number of years, international development, then went back, this probably sounds crazy to most people, but went back for a PhD, sort of when I was midway into my career, I guess you'd say, and now I've been doing this for 10 years. There are lots of different paths. Some folks were sort of academics through and through and kind of went straight from undergrad into academic study. Lots of different interesting experiences. So I really encourage you to make the most of this, not just to get a credit, that's nice, but more to have the chance to get to know professors, get to know the various disciplines that we have on offer at USD, get to know each other a little bit, and to feel more comfortable about what a classroom looks like and what those expectations are. That's why, I throw little things out there. How to address your professor. When you're writing an email, it's always better to be more cautious. It's not a text. Dear Professor so and so, I'm writing because I wanted to ask, whatever it is, they're going to be happy to interact with you as long as you're showing that you're trying to give them the accord that they're due. So we're going to try to introduce little things like that. All of this is meant, more than anything else, to give you a sense of what life in college is like, and specifically what life at USD is like. I don't want to go on and on. That is something that I can do sometimes, and some professors, you know, we are hopefully very comfortable talking to large groups, but sometimes too comfortable. So I'm going to cut myself off there and say it's very nice to meet you all. We'll be with you throughout these several weeks together. If you have any questions for me, I'm happy to, reach out. You should have my email address, but it's my first initial A, Terrell, my last name, at sandiego.edu. If you have questions about law, if you have questions, and this goes for your entire time at USD, any questions about political science or international relations, which is my academic home, or anything else, or if you're a model United Nations person or would like to become one, I'm also the faculty advisor for that. And we're always looking for people who are excited about the international ideas and model United Nations. I'm happy to tell you more about that. Dr. Smith, do you want to do an introduction to as well for
Well, I'll
yourself?
do a brief, yeah, I'll just do a brief intro. So, my name is Professor Smith. You guys have been in contact with me via email and Canvas message and all these things. I work in the languages department. I'm in the French section, and I've been at USD I just finished my 6th year. So it doesn't go by fast. But yeah, we've been running this program for 4 years, and it's just a great taste of college for you all to kind of get a feel for the rhythm and the differences between high school and university style lectures. But we're really hoping that you can kind of sit back, relax, and enjoy these talks and, take any notes while you're listening. Obviously, there's no quizzes or tests. But yeah, feel free to pop any comments as people are talking into the chat, any questions you have. We'll do a Q&A at the end. And if we don't get to everything, typically in your section discussion, that gives you more time to sort of, informally discuss these things. And so we're going to start with Dr. Michael Lovette-Colyer.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you. And I want to join Dr. Terrell and Dr. Smith in saying how excited I am to be with you today and how excited I am to welcome you to campus in another month or so. And I'm really excited to be a part of this first USD series. This is my 2nd year doing it. So I was able to do it last year and excited to be back again this year. I've been at USD a long time. I just celebrated my 19th year, or I'm starting my 20th year now. So a very long time, longer than some of you have been alive, which definitely makes me feel old. But USD is such a wonderful place that it's been a tremendous joy and honor to be a part of it so long. I teach in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. I'll be teaching a class in the LLC program in the fall. I'm part of the Advocate LLC, and the class I'm teaching is Introductory Studies in Catholic Theology, which is THRS 114. I hope maybe one or two of you or more might be in that class. But so my topic today is Caring for Our Common Home, the Legacy of Pope Francis and the Contribution of the Catholic Intellectual Tradition. I was planning on and hoping to present something like this early in the spring. And then, of course, some of you might know that Pope Francis died in April. And so it became even more important to me. It felt more meaningful to highlight the many contributions that he made during his life and his time as the Pope, especially through this wonderful document called Adaptation. So I'm very glad to be with you today. All right, I'm going to launch in. So just before I start to talk about Pope Francis and the document that you read the introduction for and related things, I just want to spend a moment about theology. In the university life, we refer to different subjects we teach. In high school, you probably talk about subjects. What's your favorite subject? Maybe it's math, maybe social studies, something like that. Or what subject? And so theology is one of the many disciplines you might study. And many of the disciplines at a university have a word that looks like theology, or that last part of the word ology, which basically means the study of. So you think about later today, you're going to hear from Dr. Danos, who's a professor of biology. There's that word again, or sociology, or philosophy, sociology. The ology part more or less translates as the study of. So theo translates as God, and ology, the study of. So theology, briefly, succinctly understood, is the study of God. Does that make sense? Before I get ahead. I just wanted to highlight that because, again, you'll be hearing from a biologist later today. Dr. Taddeo is also a professor. Her field is environmental and ocean studies. So it doesn't have that ology part. But disciplines are a big part of what makes a university a university. And what is so interesting about the different disciplines is that they each have their own method and sources. Each discipline asks slightly different questions and goes about answering those questions in a slightly different way. In theology, we talk about there are two books of revelation, two ways in which God reveals God's self. So if we're going to do God talk, if we're going to study God, we have to think about these two books, one of which you might guess, we think about Scripture, so the Bible. That's a collection of stories and how God has revealed God's self over the centuries. But the other book of Revelation that sometimes is less well appreciated or understood is the book of creation. So by looking at the natural world, we can gain great insight into how God reveals God's self to us. And that's especially relevant for this topic that we're talking about today and thinking about the environment and the work of Pope Francis. Again, before I dive in, just want to show this picture. I love this picture. I think it captures what makes a university so splendid and so wonderful and a great place to be as an employee and as a student. The university, in my estimation, is the world's best dinner party, where you have this wonderful mix of people coming from different disciplines, asking different questions, answering those questions in slightly different ways. And when you get us all together and start having conversations like we're doing today, like you'll do through your LLC program and in other ways, it really provides an enjoyable, very rich conversation. That's what makes a university so great. Okay, that's enough introduction. So in the chat, time for you to do some work. If you could please type in the name. So I hope you had a chance to type in and more importantly, to think about a place that you find meaningful, a place that you love, and a place that you love to be. As I thought about it, I wanted to share my answer to the question. These are pictures from just earlier this month. I was on an annual family vacation. On the right, that's my daughter. We every July spend time with my parents at the beach. They live in North Carolina. And being at that beach with my family is just so special. And of course, it's special because the beach is beautiful. And if you're coming to San Diego, maybe you like the beach, and plenty of beautiful beaches here. But this beach in particular has a resonance for me. And I go back to it often in my mind when I'm thinking about my family, thinking about how beautiful the world is, I think about this particular spot. So shifting gears, we'll come back to that because that's a big part of the way I want to conclude my sharing today. Some of you may know the answer to this, and if you do, great. And if you don't, that's okay too. But I wonder if anybody would be willing to type into the chat where in the Bible we find a creation account. In other words, the story about how the world was created. Yeah, very good. Many of you know it. The book of Genesis. Great. What's interesting, however, and one of the things that I like to talk about in the Introduction to Catholic Studies class I teach, is that there are actually two creation accounts. Many people know that it's Genesis, but fewer people know that there's two stories there, and they're pretty different. The first one is at the very start of the book of Genesis, so the very start of what sometimes is called the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Old Testament. And in that first creation story, it's that familiar, or somewhat, if you're familiar at all, you're used to this pattern where God said, let there be light, and then there was light. And then God reflects on that and says that it was good the first day. And God moves through a series of 6 days, and on the seventh day, God rests. What's interesting is that second to last bullet point, which is after God creates human beings, God tells them to be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and all the living things that crawl on the earth. So that language has sometimes been extrapolated to form what has been called a dominion theology. The idea that human beings are the pinnacle of creation and therefore are entitled and have the right to do whatever we like to the rest of creation, because that's what God intended. And in some ways, you can see the logic there coming from this story to that sort of thinking about human beings' place in the world. Again, there's two stories, though. The next one is a familiar story to many people, which is the story of Adam and Eve. And in this story, the instruction God gives to human beings is quite different. You see it there in the bolded, in the second bullet point. Human beings are called to cultivate and care for the earth. And this leads to a very different sense of what human beings' responsibility is to the earth. So it's not about having the right to have dominion and to control and to subdue the earth, but it's the responsibility to cultivate and care for it. This is a theme that Pope Francis takes up and makes central to his writings in the encyclical Laudato Si, the introduction for which you read before class today. So Laudato Si, it was written by Pope Francis in 2015. This year, the 10th anniversary of that. And here at USD, we did a variety of things to acknowledge that 10 years. In the introduction that you read, you saw, hopefully, that the name comes from St. Francis. And St. Francis, of course, is the person for whom Pope Francis chose his name. He wanted to honor St. Francis by choosing that name. And it comes from St. Francis's famous canticle or song, and the words, "Praise be to you, my Lord." That's why it's called Laudato Si. One of the things that's most striking about the document is that it's the first ever papal letter like this. There's a long tradition of these kinds of documents. This is the very first one ever in the history of the Catholic Church that's not just addressed to the Catholic world, but Pope Francis is hoping and seeking and trying to enter into conversation with everybody, every single person living on the planet, because he's addressing an issue that, of course, has relevance to us all. Sometimes this document is misunderstood to be about the environment. Sometimes people even call it the green encyclical or the green papal document. It is about the environment, but it's about so much more. It's about creation, and that includes both the environment as well as humans. And that's a really important point of what Pope Francis was trying to get at through it. Through the document, he addresses what is sometimes called a multifaceted alienation. That's a fancy word, but basically it comes down to the idea that so often we're alienated from ourselves, from one another, from God, and from creation. And these things amplify each other, multiply each other, and lead to all kinds of negative consequences that we see in the natural world. In the introduction that you read, the very last paragraph, Pope Francis very nicely summarizes the themes that he's going to come back to throughout the rest of the encyclical, in case you'd ever want to read it. But he highlights one of the most important ones is that there's this relationship between the poor and the fragility of the planet. And in other words, it is those who don't have a lot of resources, the poor, that are most dramatically impacted by a changing global climate. They don't have the resilience or the resources to protect themselves or to recover when there are changes to the natural environment, whether that means they can no longer make their living through farming or raising livestock, or that they literally lose the ability to live where they are because the conditions have changed. So there's this connection between the environment and its impact on the poor. And Pope Francis highlights that very much throughout the document. I love this. He says, everything is connected. That's probably the phrase that comes up the most in the whole document. It goes right to what Dr. Terrell was talking about at the start of our session today, which is integration. So that's one of the reasons we prioritize at USD integration, seeing the connections between things, because if we're really going to understand what's happening, we have to understand how these dynamics are connected. Pope Francis in the document wants to critique what he calls a technocratic paradigm. That's a fancy language for sometimes the assumption that's not always conscious that science and technology will save us, that it can solve all of our problems. What Francis wants to argue is that science and technology is a wonderful opportunity, but it alone won't save us. It will require human beings making good use of science and technology in an ethical and moral way to make progress. He also wants to call us to a new way of thinking about progress. Too often, the unexamined assumption is that more is better and that more technology is progress. But there are ways in which more is not better and that maybe less is more. And then finally, what Pope Francis calls the throwaway culture. This goes back to the alienation. So often we're alienated from ourselves, and so we are distracted and we don't really even know what we want, and we just kind of move through things very quickly and discard whatever it is when we're done with it and when we're ready for something new. And that's pretty firmly established in our culture, that you upgrade your phone as soon as you can, or you move on to the next thing as soon as possible. And Pope Francis is really cautioning us to rethink to what degree or another we're complicit with the culture that encourages us just to dispose of things as soon as they don't seem to be as valuable or as novel as they used to be. In the document, Laudato Si, Pope Francis draws upon the best science possible in 2015, consulting with world famous scientists and accomplished scholars to say what's happening to our common home. What does this book of Revelation, that is creation, tell us about what's happening? He highlights pollution, the way in which pollution is a factor, and again links that to the throwaway culture. He talks about water, how water is a human right, and yet in so many places it's hard to get fresh, healthy, potable water. And in too many other places, it's becoming not a right, but it's becoming a commodity that companies want to sell. Talks about the loss of biodiversity. And my colleagues who will speak after me will know much more about this than I do, but the ways in which that we have lost species. And once we lose a species, they're not coming back. And it's a really dramatic and a significant indicator of the negative consequences of what's happening to the earth. He links this to the decline in the quality of life, breakdown of society, and highlighting that these things go together. This is that multifaceted alienation. And then finally, Pope Francis draws our attention to global inequality, the ways in which some people have gotten so much more better off, earning more, having more resources, accumulating more wealth, while many other people are struggling just to sort of make it through and barely survive. And that global inequality is something that we have to pay attention to when we think about what's happening to our shared home. The key theme of the whole document, however, is everything is connected. Pope Francis uses the term integral ecology, and I love this phrase. It's a quote from later in the document. We're not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. He highlights a number of possible ways in which we need to move forward to address what's happening to our common home. But the bottom line, the fundamental response, Pope Francis argues, is to cultivate a sense of awe and wonder. To have a sense of awe and wonder at how beautiful the natural world is, so that we feel intimately connected to all that exists. And this is that reason that I wanted to have us start by naming a place that we love or find meaningful or that we love to be. Pope Francis wants us to think that if we could develop that kind of appreciation for all of the world, all of the natural environment, that would lead us to use science and technology in the appropriate ways to address the negative consequences of global climate change and to chart a different course going forward. So that sense of awe and wonder, which is easy to overlook the importance of, instead to sort of think about, well, we'll just invent our way out of it. And we're going to need technology to solve the issues. But the most fundamental driver of the motivation to do that, Pope Francis would suggest, is a wonderful sense of awe and wonder for the natural environment. Okay, that's where I'll end, and I'll turn it over, I think, to Dr. Danos is up next.
Well, hello everyone. I'm Dr. Sophie Taddeo. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental and Ocean Sciences. I teach a few mapping class, a few ecology class, and sort of my research, my work, my interests are in thinking about how we can best protect nature in cities. I also study wetlands. But what I want to talk about today is very much linked to this idea of a common home, of integral ecology. So I want to talk about how we can increase the capacity of ecosystems to withstand the impact of climate change and how that benefits social communities as well. So I'll begin my presentation by talking about some examples of the impacts of climate change on natural communities and ecosystems. And then I'll talk about how we can increase the resilience of ecosystems and human communities. And I'll conclude by talking about how increasing the health of natural communities can also benefit human population. So we know that climate change has profound effects on ecological communities, and human populations. By ecological communities, I mean the plants, the insects, the animals that are all in one location and interact with one another. So I would love if you could drop in the chat examples of consequences of climate change on either humans or animals, plants you can think of. So feel free to add any examples of climate change and its impacts you're aware of. Rising sea level, floods, flash flooding. Yes, the loss of diversity, the wildfires, all great examples. So let me go through a few examples in more depth. So on the left, we have wildfires, which if you've grown up on the West Coast of the United States, you might be intimately familiar with. So we know that with climate change, increasing temperature and droughts, wildfire are increasing in intensity, duration, and frequency. And of course, that has impact on animals, insects who are losing their habitats following a wildfire. It also has impact on human population due to the health consequence of breathing the particles that are emitted during a wildfire. On the right, another critical and intimate example of climate change is heat waves, which are increasing in duration. So you may know, for example, that Europe just experienced a massive heat wave, which happened earlier than it normally does. And a heat wave is when the heat exceeds or is linked with human impacts. So we know that during heat waves, there are consequences on animals, for example, where the heat is too much for them to handle. There's consequences on human health. Um, but particularly during heat waves, we typically observe an excess of death. And it also has impacts on infrastructure. So, for example, recently during the heat wave in Europe, Paris had to temporarily close the Eiffel Tower because it was just too hot. So you've all had really good examples of the consequences of climate change. So we know that everybody experiences the consequences of climate change. However, some ecological communities and some human communities are more exposed to climate change, and some are also less equipped to recover from the consequences of climate change. So if we go back to the example of wildfires, we know from various studies that some forests will recover faster after a fire. We can measure the recovery of a forest by looking at how long it takes for the forest to gain the height of the trees, the diversity of the trees in their biomass, so their total volume after a fire. So some forests will recover quicker if they're less stressed, if they have more diversity than others. Similarly, the vulnerability of human population to climate change varies a lot with geographic location, income, race, social network. So if we go back to some of our previous examples, unhoused people are particularly vulnerable to heat waves because they don't have access to cooler environment or uneasy access to water in some cases. Another good example of vulnerability to climate change is Hurricane Katrina, which is the picture on the right of the slide. So Hurricane Katrina occurred in 2005, and it resulted in over 125 billions in damage in Louisiana and over 1,300 fatalities. Since it's been 20 years since Hurricane Katrina happened, it allowed researchers to study how income, race, social network in, impacted the capacity of different neighborhoods to recover following the hurricane by tracking how long it took them to recover the economic activity prior to the hurricane. So what researchers noticed is that recovery was slower for certain groups. So low-income communities, for example, took way longer to recover after the hurricane because they probably didn't have their resources to recover quickly. Marginalized population also for them it took much longer to recover from this hurricane. This map, I think, is another example of how communities that are exposed to very similar stressors might be more vulnerable and less equipped to recover from consequences. So this map shows in various shades of green communities that are less vulnerable to climate change because their preparedness or access to resource exceeds their vulnerability to climate change. And on orange, so different shades of orange, this is the flip side. So communities that are more exposed to climate change, so where their exposure exceeds their capacity to recover. And we see that in counties in California that are exposed to very similar impacts of climate change, like droughts, wildfire, heat waves, flooding, which is our examples you've put in the chat. Some communities are way more vulnerable. So San Diego County, for example, on this map is less vulnerable than Imperial County, which is the county next door. And there's various reasons for that. So some communities are more exposed to climate change because they have less reliable infrastructure, lower income, less access to healthcare. So this brings me to the notion of resilience. So resilience refers to the capacity of individuals or natural communities to withstand, recover, and adapt from gradual changes or more abrupt shocks. Just to visualize or think about the concept of resilience, I'd like you to take a moment to think about a moment in your life where you were faced with a challenge. So it can be a small challenge, doesn't have to be a massive challenge. So reflect on this challenge and think about what enabled you to overcome this challenge. Maybe you got advice from a friend or family member. Maybe you got help from someone at school. Maybe you did an internet search to find resources that enabled you to find strategies to overcome this challenge. So all of these resources enable you to face this challenge, overcome it, and eventually recover from this challenge. So this is essentially the concept of resilience. The concept of resilience is often illustrated using this ball and cup metaphor that you see on the slide, where we have a ball that, due to a force or a stressor, is moved from its initial position. So it changes position in the cup. If the system, the individual, the community is resilient, the ball will eventually return it in its initial position. The time that it takes for the ball to return to its initial position depends on the force, the strength of the force that moved it, but also on access to resource. However, there are situations in which the force that is exerted on the ball is so strong that it ends up in a completely different cup. So in cup A or cup C on this figure. In such case, we'll say that the disturbance was so strong that it exceeded the resilience capacity of this ball. So a visual example of that is looking at these two lakes. So those two lakes are right next to one another. On the right, we have a lake that is clear, relatively healthy, versus on the left, we have a lake where, as a consequences of agricultural pollution due to the use of fertilizer, there's been a lot of growth of algae and plant matter. All this algae and plant matter uses a lot of oxygen, which then decreases the amount of oxygen available for fish population, leading to their death. So at some point, this lake is so deprived of oxygen that even removing the stressor, in this case, agricultural pollution, will not return the lake to its pre-disturbance condition, so to a healthy fish population. Um, so what we want to do is essentially increase the resilience of natural communities so we don't get to this state where it's excessively hard to return the system to its ecological condition, like in the lake on the left. So I'd like to briefly talk about some properties of resilient ecological communities. So what makes nature better able to withstand stressors like different extreme climatic events and recover following extreme climatic events. So one of the things that research shows is that ecological communities that are more diverse tend to be better equipped to recover following a disturbance. And this is illustrated by this experiment from Germany, where you see the different squares on the picture are different plant communities, where there are more or less plants. So in some squares, we have a lot of different plant species, in some square, just one plant species. And the experiment is flooding the entire field to see how long it takes for the different squares to recover, so to regain their plant height, their plant diversity. And what research shows is that diverse communities tend to recover way faster following an extreme event. For a few reasons. One of them is that if you have more different plants, you increase the likelihood that you have a plant that is particularly adapted to difficult conditions. The second reason is that if you have one plant species that is particularly adapted to difficult condition, it might be able to protect other plant species. So for example, it may provide resource for birds during and after the flood. It may help protect other smaller plant species against wind. So diversity, we know, is really important in promoting the capacity of natural communities to recover from extreme climatic events. Another strategy of or property of resilient ecological communities is both space and connectivity. So by space, I mean, for example, larger forests are better able to recover following a wildfire because if you have a large forest, you increase the likelihood that not the entire forest is impacted. So maybe a section of the forest is impacted. So the unimpacted, undisturbed forest can then supply the seeds, the animals that are required for the impacted forest to recover. Similarly, connectivity, which means do you have another forest close by? Um, Increase the resilience of habitats for a very similar reason because the undisturbed forest can supply seeds, animals that allows the disturbed forest to recover quicker. The last property of resilient ecological communities that I'll present is stress. So we know that ecosystems tend to be less resilient, so less capable of withstanding climate change for a few reasons. One of them is that they tend to be less diverse, so to have fewer species. Also because stress decreases their capacity to recover. So if we think, for example, vegetation that's on the slope of a mountain, if this vegetation is impacted by drought or a pest outbreak, it may lack the biomass, the root system to prevent erosion during a flooding event. Similarly, if we have a forest or a grassland that is impacted by overgrazing, so too many animals are munching on the grassland, that may impact the soil system, which then impacts vegetation capacity to recover after a drought. So those were some of examples of how different communities, natural communities, might be more or less resilient to climate change. So I'm curious if you can think of similarities between the characteristics of resilient ecological communities and resilient human communities. In other words, do you think that diversity is also important in human communities? So you can drop examples or thoughts in the chat about how the resilience of ecological communities is similar to the resilience of human community. Yeah, so we think high diversity might be impactful in human communities as well. I'll keep going with some example. Connectivity also great. So if we think about the resilience of human communities, it's really similar to the resilience of natural communities. So just like stress, natural communities, so plants, for example, are less resilient to climate change when they're stressed. We see a really similar pattern in social communities. So low-income communities tend to be more vulnerable to climate change and less resilient to climate change because they lack the resource to rebuild, recover after climate change. So this is illustrated by this map where you see the gradient increase in green, represents the vulnerability to climate change, and the gradient in red color represents countries that are emitting a lot of greenhouse gases that are contributing to climate change. And so what we see here is that a lot of Western countries are big contributors to climate change, but are less vulnerable to its consequences because they have the resources to recover. from climate change. On the flip side, a lot of African countries are not big emitter of climate change, but they're very vulnerable and less resilient because they may lack their financial resources or infrastructure to recover from extreme climatic events. Another way in which some human communities might be more resilient is the strength of social networks. So if you're in a community that is very well connected, where governance is very inclusive, there might be an increased resilience to extreme climatic events because it favors the sharing of information, community mobilizing of resources, and collective action. So, for example, if you have a very well-connected society, we may be better equipped to share food or food bank resources after a flooding event. Another example of that is that some research that was focusing on the deadly heat wave in Chicago saw that individuals were less likely to die if they had strong social connections that enable them to find access to cooler environment, to resources, to withstand heat wave. There's some research too that suggests that very diverse communities or very diverse companies even tend to be more resilient because that promotes innovation, creativity, and that enables us to find solutions or strategies to recover following an extreme climatic event. So now that we've saw that the characteristics of resilient natural communities and the characteristics of resilient human communities are very similar, I want to leave you with some thoughts on how increasing the resilience of natural communities can also benefit human communities. So there's an increasing interest in the ecological communities in devising nature-based solution to increase the well-being of human population. So nature-based solutions are any intervention in which we are protecting, enhancing nature, and that has positive consequences on a human population. So a very good example of that is increasing trees in cities to decrease vulnerability to heat waves. So if you've grown up in a city, you may have noticed that if you visit a park where there's a lot of vegetation, a lot of shade, that feels immediately cooler than if you're in the middle of downtown. So there's a lot of cities across the United States that are increasing their total tree cover to be better prepare communities to upcoming heat waves, particularly in low-income communities that tend to have less access to nature. Another example of that is in restoring wetland ecosystems. So a benefit of wetlands is that they're really good at sequestering carbon and reducing flood risk because they serve as sinks, so they can really absorb water like a sponge, which then decrease flood risk for communities that are located close by. So restoration of wetland really benefits coastal communities. So real quick, I'm curious if you can suggest any additional examples you can think of how improving the health of ecological communities could benefit humans. So I'll give you 10-20 seconds to drop some examples in the chat. So how we can improve nature and how it benefits us. Yes, increasing mangroves can decrease water pollution because mangroves are really good at trapping sediments. Reducing carbon emission benefits natural communities, and then we get all the benefits from natural communities. Using green roofs, that's a great example, allows us to decrease our reliance on AC, but it also provides habitat for bees in cities. So those are all excellent examples. So just to recap briefly, climate change is impacting all ecological human communities, but some are most exposed and some are more or less resilient. We know that diversity, connectedness, and being less stressed allows both ecological communities and human communities to be more resilient to climate change. And I hope I've convinced you that improving the resilience of nature, of ecological communities, is also critical for human physical and mental well-being. So, thank you very much. And with that, I'll pass it to Dr. Danos.
Excellent. Thanks all for being here. My name is Dr. Nicole Danos. I'll tell you a lot about my journey of how I got to USD as part of this presentation. We heard from Dr. Lovette-Colyer about the need for awe and wonder to be part of what motivates us to take action. And from Dr. Taddeo that appreciating biodiversity or learning about diversity and supporting it is going to be key to us surviving the climate change that we've created. I wanted to take a slightly different approach to this and tell us all that those two things should be easy because in exploring the natural world around us, there is joy to be had. That joy is permissible. And in fact, it's something that we should all pursue. And so the lesson that I want to leave you all with is that learning about the natural environment around us can promote a sense of belonging, empowerment, and motivate us to take action. So for many of you, USD is going to be your new natural environment pretty soon. So I'm going to give you a poll. I'm going to show you 4 animals, and I want you to tell me which of these animals lives within 10 miles of USD campus. Okay, you ready? I'm going to show you the photos. This is a Brahminy blind snake, the red-crowned Amazon parrot, the American badger, and the mountain lion, cougar, panther, whatever it's called in your region of the world. You can choose more than one animals. A lot of you chose the mountain lion. That's true. Mountain lions live within 10 miles of campus, and they're often captured on trail cams. The American badger also lives here, and that was news to me until recently. They're found down by the San Diego River that is just south of campus. The red-crowned Amazon parrot, despite its name, it's not native here. It did not evolve in place here in San Diego, but it was released as pets. And they liked San Diego just as much as we did. And so they've established strong populations. And you'll see them coming through campus, especially in the spring when they're looking for nesting sites. Similarly, the Brahminy blind snake is a snake that you might encounter after a strong rain. It lives underground. It's blind, as its name suggests. It's tiny. You might confuse it for an earthworm. But what distinguishes it is the little scales, if you can notice, on its body. It doesn't have those rings that a that an earthworm would have. Okay, so all of these animals will be found within 10 miles of campus. And so this diversity of animals is what I study as a biologist. Okay, I'll show you here a few examples of the animals I've studied since I started my research. I've studied chameleons here and introduced in Hawaii. I studied frogs here, Papua New Guinea, and other parts of the US. Fish, including some weird species that live deep in the deep sea. And lately I'm focused only on mammals, working on the biology of motherhood. So I'm really interested in how baby pigs feed from their mother as a model for how humans also feed from their mother. And also what happens to the body of the mother when she becomes pregnant. So the types of questions that interest me have to do with the structure of an organism, how that structure functions in the daily life of that animal, and then how has that changed over time. I didn't set out to be this type of scientist. I grew up in a very small island country called Cyprus. It's all the way in the Eastern Mediterranean. The majority of the population here is ethnically Greek, myself included. And when I say it's a small country, it's small. It's smaller than the state of Connecticut, and there's fewer than 1 million people on there. But because it is so strong and it has a strong culture of education, most teenagers leave the island to study abroad for university. And so in 1998, I received a Fulbright scholarship from the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, to come here to the U.S. And so without ever having been to the U.S., I left this environment that was ethnically very, very diverse. You'll see a Muslim minarets here, and a mosque, and old Byzantine churches living side by side. I left this place and I traveled about 12,000 kilometers, almost 7,000 miles to UC Berkeley, California. And to say that that was a major culture shock, that is an understatement. Okay. I find myself here very, very alone, even though I spoke great English, but nothing made sense. Things started to make sense once I started going on local field trips with my biology classes. I learned about the native newts. These are salamanders that live there, swimming snakes like the garter snake, tiny salamanders that live everywhere. Again, they tend to look like earthworms. And then big, magnificent trees like the live oaks, the redwoods, of course, in Northern California. And then I started going on even further field trips to the Mojave Desert, where I met my very first and only horned lizard. I've been hunting these animals ever since, have never seen one again. Lots and lots of rattlesnakes, way too close for comfort, but still have never been bitten. And then in San Francisco, across the bay from campus, I got to meet the sea lions that have taken over the pier there. And even a little bit north of San Francisco, I went on a field trip where we counted all the Tule elk that live out there. So there's a peninsula, and all the students formed a line and walked from inland in the peninsula all the way to the tip. And we all counted the animals that walked past our line, right? Because if everybody was out there and we were coming in, they had to cross our line. And that was an annual event that happens, that college students take part in to monitor these populations. And on the way back, we turned around and there's a bunch of whales breaching behind us. After my first year at Berkeley, I started feeling a lot more like I started to belong there, because I could now name the plants and the animals that surrounded me. Okay. And so knowing the natural world led to a sense of belonging, even from somebody who had traveled so far geographically, ethnically, culturally, to be in this place. And this was the idea behind one of the brief readings that I had for you, The Diary of a Young Naturalist. This is the story of a person that feels at home when the natural environment around them starts feeling familiar, right? And so just out of curiosity, do you want to tell me in the chat where many of you are coming to San Diego from? All over the Western US. I see some East Coast folks. I even see some international people. Welcome. Welcome to San Diego. We're excited to have you here. Wow, okay. Great. Even local San Diegans, I think, will get a lot out of being on campus and getting to know the natural environment here. Okay, I want to tell you a little bit about the story of how I ended up being a biologist, and especially the type of biologist that does what I do now. So yes, I was going on field trips. I was getting to know the natural world around me. I started feeling more like I belonged. But it wasn't just that I was belonging, it was like I really was getting joy out of getting to know the world around me, okay? And this joy motivated me to look for a research position while I was still an undergraduate in a natural history museum, the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology. And while the collections are focused on the Western US here, we actually had specimens from all over the world. I worked in the herpetology collection, so the study of reptiles and amphibians. And just by cataloging and working with all these specimens, I got to see and appreciate more about what makes each of them unique, but also what unites them. And that's where I first noticed, for example, that horned lizard that I saw on my very first desert field trip looks very similar to a lizard that's all the way from Australia. So the one on the left is called a horned lizard, and it's completely unrelated to the devil's horned lizard from Australia. Okay? And this started getting me to think, why would you grow a skin that has these protrusions? Why would you want to be spiky? Why would you want to be kind of dorsoventrally flat from top and bottom? It must have something to do with where they live and how they make their living. And so these types of observations led me to ask questions about the links between structure, function, and evolution. And this was sort of the idea behind the other reading or the video that I gave you to watch about how birds inspire builders. The idea here again is that we all face similar problems to what animals in this world have experienced for a really, 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 really long time, much longer than we have been here. And so getting to know the natural world, its history, and how it found solutions to similar problems might actually help us answer some of the pressing problems that we have right now. And in this example, in this video, it talked a little bit about how kingfishers or animals that dive for their food can be used as a source of biomimetic inspiration for solving problems like bullet trains going through moving really fast through tight spaces, woodpeckers helping football players by designing better helmets, right? And those are just some of the really obvious examples that we have right now. Every bit of information that we learn by studying the natural world becomes part of the source of knowledge that we use when it's time to come to solve a problem. Okay? But a lot of that knowledge did not arise because we set out to solve the problem. It arose because we were taking joy in getting to know the world around us, and we were enjoying being part of this world. Okay.
Bullet trains creating sonic.
I won't play this now, but I will tell you a couple more examples of how this pursuit of getting to know the world around you, even if it's just for the fun of it, can actually lead to a really big impact in the scientific community. We're all very connected these days. Thank you, COVID. And we are in a time in our technological culture where we can generate immense amounts of data, right? Think about these trail cams that are out there. They're capturing animals that are moving around the clock. And you can set a network of these cameras in a giant park like the Serengeti, for example. So how can those two things, people being interconnected, large amounts of data, actually work together to advance science? There's a lot of movement now towards what's called citizen science. And Zooniverse is one of these platforms that makes it easy for scientists to present their work and their projects in a way that the public can participate. So if you're ever looking for something to do in between classes or between studying, you want to change a little bit your mindset, I recommend signing up for it and checking out the diversity of projects that they have there. I assigned this in my classes, and I had students report that they prefer this to playing games on their phone, because instead of doing something mindless that nobody benefits from, you could be out there looking at footage, again, of a park, identifying humans when they should not be, where they should not be, or doing even more interesting things like cataloging interactions between animals, or identifying cell types, right? So I highly recommend this as a way to connect with places even further away than USD. And citizen science is not really a new thing. It's been going on for over, we can debate this, but one of the really long standing projects that still exists is the Audubon Christmas Day bird count. And so the Audubon Society is a society of bird watchers. If you know any bird watchers in your lives, you know they're very passionate about keeping a list of the birds that they've seen and trying to make as many of those observations as possible. And so the Audubon Society has organized bird watchers for more than 100 years to go out on Christmas Day and count the birds that they see around them. Without it being the intention initially, it now has become an incredible database for researchers, right? You can go back to the same location for 115 years and know what was there when, what happens after a big natural disaster, how fast does it come back. These observations are critically important for science, and they come from lay people, not from scientists themselves.
A brief introduction to the Zooniverse.
I will give you the link to that so you can check it out later, okay? Just as an example, there's over 3 million observations on there, and there's 100,000 people participating and contributing to science on this one database and platform alone. And there's more than that. If you're looking to be active in the San Diego area and you want to get to know more about the natural world, in particular the animals, you notice that is my bias. That's kind of what I'm passionate about. But the natural world consists of a lot more than just the vertebrate animals, right? I highly recommend this group called the Canyoneers. It's a free group that goes on hikes around San Diego. It's led by a naturalist, a person that knows where you're going and can show you around. They'll take you to different places around San Diego and show you what's what. I highly recommend it. I also recommend the Natural History Museum as a place to visit, and they always show some incredible films there too. And lastly, I will make a plug for classes in biology, classes that teach about the diversity of animals. One of the classes I teach is Natural History of Vertebrates, where we do exactly what I was just describing. We go through the vertebrate animals of San Diego in communities, and we learn about them. We go out every week and we visit those places. And then over a weekend, we travel all the way from the ocean to the desert, and we explore how these communities change along that transect. There's also classes about desert biology, insect biology, or taking more community approach, ecological communities. And so with that, I hope I convinced you that there is joy to be had just in learning about the natural world, that joy can be motivating. It can help you feel like you belong in any new place. And it can empower you to find solutions to pressing problems, okay? And so with that, you have the permission to be joyful when you're out in nature and not to constantly worry about the effects of climate change. Yeah, you have our permission.
So I just want to thank you all for your thought-provoking comments, your questions. I know it's time. If anything comes up between now and next week, email us. We're happy to help. And yeah, wishing you a wonderful rest of your afternoon, evening, maybe morning, wherever you are located. And we will see you next week.
It's great to meet you all.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.